Welcome back, Beyond Rome listeners, and we are back with Joe Heschmeyer from Catholic Answers yet again. We are so excited to have you back, Joe, to talk about something very controversial that also needs clarification. And this is, do Catholics, Jews, and Muslims all worship the same God? And my awesome co-host, James O'Reilly, is going to direct that conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on, Joe. And for those who aren't listening, Joe is, or if you didn't listen to our previous podcast with Joe or episode, he's with Catholic Answers, a senior. What's the title, Joe?
I'm just a regular apologist.
Regular apologist. All right,
guys who've been at it a lot longer than me.
Right, but still,
he's getting a promotion now. He's getting a promotion.
Right, in the works. But we're honored to have you on. But yeah, I'll start with the question that Simone posed: do Muslim, Jews, and Christians worship the same God?
They do, and this is something that Vatican II actually talks about, but not just Vatican II. This is actually the long-standing Christian position in terms of understanding the relationship of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So Nostra Aetate talks about how Muslims, quote, adore the one God, living and subsisting in himself, merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth, who's spoken to men, end quote. Now, I want to say something very clearly at the beginning, which is, in saying we worship the same God, this is a very low bar. Mm-hmm. Like, if you say, I think the God of Abraham is terrible, and I say, I think the God of Abraham is great, we're talking about the same God. We're saying opposite things. So we don't want to fall into the trap that, well, if we both are orienting our worship towards the God of Abraham, therefore good enough. But we don't want to fall into the opposite trap of saying, well, if we believe different things about the God of Abraham, therefore we don't believe in the same God. That doesn't follow logically. We just came out of a political situation. We had the election cycle.
And we're recording this in mid-November for record.
Yes, but I think whenever this airs, it'll still be relevant.
Right.
Mm-hmm. You can take a political figure and you can talk to two different people of different parties and persuasions and say, describe that person to me, and get wildly different pictures. Mm-hmm. And maybe someone who doesn't know much about them would say, oh, they must be referring to two different people. Like, these pictures are so different that they sound like two completely different people.
Who could you possibly be talking about, Joe Heschmeyer?
You can do this with a lot of politicians.
That was a brilliant analogy, but
I don't want to compare any politician to God, but I think that's only going to feed into that. But the point is, you could make a word picture of just like, oh, describe so-and-so to me, and have these two opposite, in many ways, sort of pictures. And the result to that, like the way we understand that, should not be, okay, this must be two different people. The result should be maybe one or both sides is wrong in their conception. Like, maybe there's things that need to be clarified. That trait you're ascribing isn't true. It should be the opposite one, or, whatever it is. And obviously that's much more important when we're talking about God. Mm-hmm. And so, Muslims will say God does not have a son. Jews would agree. Christians would say God does have a son. Now, one side is right to that. They obviously can't both be right, but that doesn't mean we're talking about two entirely different gods.
Right. Well, would you separate then? Is it Christians versus Jews and Muslims, or does it vary between each group?
It varies topic by topic, because when we're looking at sources of divine revelation, one of the things that we have in common with Jews that we don't have in common in the same way with Muslims is we believe the Jewish scriptures are inspired.
Right.
And so God has revealed himself in the Jewish scriptures in a way that he has not in the Quran. That is very clearly the Christian view. And so there are statements in the Quran that are simply false, whereas the Jewish picture we would say is incomplete. Mm-hmm. And so there are things about God that we know now from the New Testament we wouldn't have known from the Old Testament alone. But we wouldn't say there's anything in contradiction between the Old and the New Testament. We would say that there are contradictions, and frankly, I think intentional contradictions between the Quran and the Bible. And I think either a Muslim or a Christian would be able to affirm when the Quran depicts God as saying he has no son and to stop saying he has a son, that is obviously intended as a response to the repeated affirmations in the Gospels that Jesus is the Son of God.
Yeah.
And should be read in that way, that you can't harmonize. Like one or the other of those views is actually mistaken. It's not just a matter of one being more or less complete. So when we're looking at sources of revelation, we've got a common ground with Jewish people that we don't with Muslim people.
Right.
When we're looking at theological claims, Muslims and Jews are going to line up on certain aspects of the oneness of God, where they take oneness in an anti-Trinitarian way, whereas Christians are going to be the outliers. So you'll find kind of a fascinating pairing where it'll be maybe 2-on-1 on different questions.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, more could be said, but I would say that at kind of the broad level, it's not quite as simple as an us versus them sort of thing. It's a more complicated set of, and then there are some things, of course, that we all agree on.
Yeah. Well, we might say, even with Vatican II, they might say, the church might say, we all worship the same God. Would it go the same way? Or I would imagine it doesn't among the other traditions, the other faith traditions, where they wouldn't believe that we do, or do you think they do?
It's a more complicated question from the Jewish perspective, because there's a belief that there's a false Messiah, that Jesus is a false Messiah. So what does that do for the status of people that, particularly if you are ethnically and religiously Jewish and become Catholic? And I will leave that to people who are Jewish to decide how they would kind of interpret that. It's a little clearer in the Quran, because the Quran talks about, the status of people of the book. Still, you'll find various kind of takes amongst Muslims, even on questions like that. So the Quran talks about the Injil, the Gospel of Jesus, being divinely inspired, but they believe that both the Torah and the Injil were corrupted, that Jews and Christians tampered with the biblical texts. And so what that looks like, what that means, they would say, there have been some, additions and subtractions and perversions in the text, but the underlying text itself seemingly is still divinely inspired. But the only untampered with divine text would be the Quran itself. That would be kind of the Muslim view. So there would still be the sense that, yes, we're still talking about the same God, but they would say, Christians are making false claims about that God.
Yeah.
And this is, I said this at the top, this is not a new way of understanding the relationship. So some listeners may be familiar that the older term Christians used for Muslims, that's now often considered kind of offensive, was Mohammedan.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole point was that it was understood by Christians as a Christian heresy. And heresies tend to be named after their founder, like Marcionitism, right? And so this is a pretty, so we gave it a heretical kind of nomenclature. And if you look at something like Gnosticism, so people tend to have no problem saying that one of the earliest heresies the church faced was Gnosticism, but Gnosticism gets God way more wrong than Islam does.
Right.
Like, it's actually much harder to say we worship the same God in Gnosticism, yet we regard that as a heresy rather than a totally separate religion, because it's coming from, in a weird way, the same place, but making these sometimes radically false claims about divinity. So go back all the way to 1076. In 1076, Pope St. Gregory VII writes to the Islamic king of Mauritania, Azir, and he says, quote, "We and you must show in a special way to the other nations an example of this charity, for we believe and confess one God, although in different ways, and praise and worship him daily as the creator of all ages and the ruler of this world." So I stress that to say, this is 1,000 years ago, just shy of, and he's recognizing, number one, we believe in and worship the same God, but number two, in different ways. We have different claims we're making. And I think both of those are things you want to kind of stress in the same breath, or else people will get a wrong idea of what your position is.
Right.
Now some of that may seem incontrovertible, or some people listening might be like, okay, what's the big problem there? And I will turn to Joe Carter of First Things as someone who takes the opposite position, or at least did. This is a much older article that he wrote, where he takes a position that if you deny that Jesus is the begotten Son of God, then you do not know the Father, and therefore we can't be said to worship the same God. The result of that line of thinking is that because he thinks the Trinity is an essential aspect of God, anyone who isn't Trinitarian does not believe in the same God, does not worship the same God. So that way of demarcating things would mean not only do Muslims have a different God, but so do Jewish people, so do Oneness Pentecostals, so do Unitarians, and that this ends up in this position where you would have to say even the believers in the Old Testament who did not know about the Trinity didn't worship the same God as believers in the New Testament. Well, that ends you in this really strange place, much more like, and this is going to be the second podcast with you guys that I've mentioned this heresy, much more like the heresy of Marcionitism, where you say it's a different God between the two testaments. So that way of thinking might sound logically valid at first, but as soon as you press on it, it falls apart. You have to be able to say somebody is wrong about the true God without that automatically meaning that therefore they're, right or wrong or whatever about a false God. You can get God wrong while still getting God wrong, as opposed to getting somebody else wrong.
Right. And that would be then distinction between revelation and doctrine, or is it because you said that, say because there's different revelation for Muslims versus Christians, but wouldn't you say that all Christians in a sense have the same revelation? They would just have different doctrine?
Oh, yeah. So that is right. So there's a couple ways we can kind of demarcate. When I was talking about the relationship between Jews, Muslims, Christians, there are going to be certain things where if you say, is God triune? Oneness Pentecostals, Jews, Muslims are going to say no. Christians are going to say yes. But that doesn't mean from getting the doctrinal thing, obviously coming to different conclusions where one side's getting it wrong. It doesn't mean we're believing in different gods. We're believing in different essential attributes to God.
Right.
So, you could get something essential about somebody wrong and still, so this is a silly example, but just to kind of highlight what I'm talking about, you're camping and you hear a sound and you say, I think that was a wolf. And I say, I think that was just a dog. Now, the essence of it either is wolf or dog. Maybe we see it and we still don't know. We're getting something essential wrong. One of us is. We're clearly still referring to the same creature.
Yeah.
Well, likewise, when we're doing theology, we're referring to the same God of Abraham, even if we're making contradictory claims about his nature and essence.
Well, I want to hop on something you said earlier, because you spoke of the church speaking of Islam almost as a heresy. Would that be a heresy within Christianity, more within like the Hebraic tradition?
I would say within the Hebraic tradition, right?
Okay.
Like it is far enough away from the kind of Christian origins, but if you understand the history of Islam, there are offshoots of Christianity that are influential in kind of the worldview of Muhammad, and this was recognized. So St. John Damascene, who is one of the first Christians to speak really intelligently on Islam because he grew up in a Muslim country and he's conversant in it. His critiques of Islam recognized that this is clearly Christian influenced, but has come to, and so I was in Morocco some years ago and was talking to my guide, and we were just going through, the different stories in the Quran, and is there a parallel story in the Bible? So Jonah and the whale, and he'd give like the Quranic names, Musa, and we're like, oh yeah, Moses. And we're going through this, and I'm with some other Catholics, and then he's like, in the sacrifice of Ishmael, and we're like, yeah, we got that, and they're like, wait a second, nope, actually, we've got the sacrifice of Isaac. But there's clearly Judeo-Christian roots to where the Quran is coming from. Like, you don't understand what the Quran is doing without recognizing that it is being told from the perspective that something true has been revealed to the Jews and Christians. But the claim goes, it's incomplete and corrupted and now has to be completed and purified with Muhammad. Well, and so that's kind of like, we would say, yes, we recognize that this is where it's coming from. Like, it's not Christianity, but it has to be understood in its relationship to Christianity.
Right. And even if you can understand why Islam is false and disagree on certain things. Looking at it historically, you can kind of understand, say you have the Arabian Peninsula and you have these kind of syncretic forms of Christianity and their heretical forms where people are probably to some degree worshiping the saints or minor figures, things like that. And then also mixing in with pagan gods, you have someone like Muhammad coming in and it's kind of all a mess. So he just kind of wants to get back to the roots. Almost kind of this Martin Luther drive where it's like, no, just simplify everything. There's one God, enough of this nonsense with, these minor deities and the Trinity and this mix of things. So to a certain degree, if there was this corrupted form of Christianity kind of mixing in with these other pagan forms, you can also understand where maybe this desire to simplify comes in as well.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, one of the early Christian responses was the rise of iconoclasm in the East, because there was this thought that, okay, well, partly, the Byzantine armies were losing to the armies of the Islamic Caliphate, and so they thought, is this God's judgment upon us? Have we fallen into idolatry by having images? And so they took the kind of Muslim critique of Christianity very seriously. Now, ultimately, and I think properly, the church rejected that and said, no, icons aren't the problem. Sure, you can go too far, but there's a proper and healthy respect. But it is certainly possible, as you're looking at the kind of the fringes of the Christian world, and you have a world shaped more by Nestorianism than by Catholic Christianity, that you're going to have people with a skewed theological vision of God. I think the Christology is not like the Christology in the Quran. It's not entirely clear that Muhammad understands what it is Christians believe about the Trinity or about God.
Right.
And so as a result, you say, well, how much of that is his own kind of failure to understand? How much of that is the world in which he lived? I think I would put a lot in the former, honestly. But, because he hadn't been like a practicing Christian who then became Muslim.
Right.
So he has, even as someone who has this dynamic relationship to the scriptures, he has an outsider's take on a lot of this stuff. Right. So he's never fully Christian in the first place. He's got, I believe his brother-in-law was a Nestorian priest, but it might have been his.
I think his uncle was an Arian who supposedly tutored him.
Maybe there's some kind of family connection.
Yeah.
I thought it was through marriage, but it may have been. But it's something a little more distant. And so, it's like if you've got an aunt who's a Hindu and someone says, what's Hinduism about? And you're like, I vaguely remember this stuff my aunt was telling me. And so you're going to probably get a partially correct, but maybe embarrassingly wrong depiction of it as an outsider with like a couple windows into the thing. Right. Well, that's kind of how the Quranic take of Christianity reads to a Christian. Is this is somebody who doesn't really get Christianity in the first place. And that can be, if you don't take for granted the inspiration of the Quran, you can say that is explained pretty easily by the fact that this is an outsider's understanding of Christianity that's distorted in some important ways.
Yeah. I'm going to cheat a little bit just because, one, there are so many different heresies historically, but also for our listeners, what is Nestorianism?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So Nestorianism is a heresy about the nature of Christ. So one of the kind of famous ways that it gets hammered out is, do we refer to the Virgin Mary as Theotokos, which means Mother of God, or literally God bearer? Or should we just refer to her as Christokos? I'm butchering the Greek right now. Christ bearer. In other words, does Mary bear God or just Christ?
Yeah.
On the surface, this is a debate about Mary. In reality, this is a debate about how we understand Jesus.
Right.
Is Jesus God? And like, what is the way these, we would say this is the Catholic and this is shared by the Orthodox. The view is that there's two natures. He's fully God and fully man. And so Mary is truly his mother because it's one person. He's not two separate people. Yeah. It isn't like inside one body, you have a divine Christ as a roommate to a human Jesus. And so Nestorianism, at least as it's understood, again, on the outside, by those of us who are not Nestorians, Nestorianism seemed to be treating Jesus as two subjects rather than one.
Mm-hmm. Looking at him with the wrong kind of double vision.
Yes, very much so. That's a good throwback to the other episode. And this then produces a big pushback, which then goes to the opposite extreme, what's sometimes called miaphysitism, which says, okay, yeah, there is just one Jesus, not two, but it ends up blending his human and divine natures, seemingly, in a way that doesn't make the proper distinctions. So we want to say, and this is what the Chalcedonian Christian model is, that he's fully God, fully man, one person with two natures.
Right. Well, I mean, this episode itself isn't on heresies, but I think it's important to kind of go through them and understand, because during this time where you have Islam, you also have these heresies. So it's you can understand why there's these false versions of Christianity as well. And maybe, Muslims could claim, or Islam could claim, that there's different versions of Islam and you haven't gotten the real one, or whatever it might be.
Sure. Well, and also this kind of Christian infighting is really key to understanding the rise of Islam.
Right.
So if you look at the early Christian world, the North African and Middle Eastern kind of lands are extremely Christian. Like Syria is Christian. Egypt is Christian.
Right.
Algeria is Christian.
Yeah.
What happens? Well, in a lot of cases, what happened was the Catholics and Orthodox were pretty harsh to the Nestorians and the Monophysites.
Right.
And so when the Muslims come along and promise basically Dhimmitude, it's viewed as the less bad option. Now, what quickly happens is, kind of under Islamic rule, the Christians slip away from the practice. Like Dhimmitude is sort of set up in such a way as to make it just like obnoxious enough to not be Muslim, that it makes Islam very inviting, and it's key to kind of getting ahead in the world. And so there's not like the open, incredible oppression that's going to produce martyrs and a great, surge of like Christian resilience. It's just the kind of world of inconvenience.
Yeah.
And in that world of inconvenience, the sinful nature of those of us as believers can say, yeah, if I just wasn't so much of a stickler on Jesus being divine, my life would go a lot easier. Right. And Christianity in North Africa is largely snuffed out, or takes these pretty aggressive form. Like Ethiopian Orthodox, they have to fight hard to not fall into this. The Copts, they have to fight hard to not be completely eradicated. And so they lean into, spiritual disciplines and everything else. So that's
right.
You do have to understand the world of this kind of inter-Christian conflict or intra-Christian conflict to make sense in part of the rise of Islam across these formerly Christian lands.
Yeah. That might be what. Sorry, James, if I can quickly interject. Sorry to interrupt you. I wonder if that side thought, if that's why Ethiopian Orthodox and Coptic Orthodox are so good at fasting, actually.
I always joke about this. When I was living in DC, it seemed like every Lent, right when I was feeling sorry for myself about giving up something, I would have a cab driver from Ethiopia and invariably end up on the conversation.
It's like, that's not even a real fast, Joe.
Exactly. It's like 55-day fast where you're doing veganism and standing for 3 hours in the divine liturgy. And it's just like, okay, I'll shut up. Nothing I'm doing comes anywhere close to that. But I do think there is this real sense, and this is something I think we can take from that.
Yes.
That the Christians who knew their faith was on the line leaned into the spiritual disciplines in a much greater way. And I think probably Islam was in some ways both a challenge and maybe a healthy influence. I mean, Ramadan is no joke.
It's no joke.
And so, to go sun up to sundown without even water, I had a hot dog vendor who was right outside my work who I got to know, and he was a pretty devout Muslim, and it would be hot out there, and he's selling hot dogs while fasting.
Oh,
and I'm just like, I don't think I could do it. I would break. But leaning into, not in an unhealthy way, but leaning into spiritual disciplines in such a way, that's something where I think maybe one of the kind of unexpected takeaways from this episode is, view this as a challenge to the places where we've gotten weak and slack, and take that very seriously. I think that was the appropriate response to the Reformation, saying, okay, what are the things we need to fix in-house? I think that's the appropriate response to the rise of Islam, or to any kind of persecution. Not a sort of woe is me, this is all my fault attitude. Sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
But to say, is there something in need of purification? This is certainly Israel's response to the Babylonian captivity. And I think that's a healthy response to always be saying, what do I take away from the fact that maybe I've got this new challenge or new oppression or new, someone is being critical of me. What can I take from that in a spiritually healthy way to come out stronger?
Yeah. You did mention Dhimmitude earlier. I don't think that's a term that most people are familiar with.
Yes.
But I think it's important because it does I think it kind of tells something about the relationship between the two. But could you define it for us real quick?
Yeah. So dhimmi is like non-Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And tude is like from like servitude. So how, so think about the word Gentile, which, was used to mean like a non-Jew.
Yeah.
And dhimmi is kind of the version of that. So if you are living in an officially Islamic country, and at least historically, what are the kind of obligations on you? So this might be paying taxes and these other things. Like there's certain political positions are closed off to you. The Ottoman Empire is pretty famous for this. And so doors are closed in your life where it isn't like you're going to be rounded up and executed. You can openly live as a non-Muslim,
right?
But your life will be made harder.
Sort of softer persecution.
Right, exactly. Softer persecution, which, by the way, is a much more effective form of persecution to break Christians.
Yeah.
Like if you say we're going to round people up and put them in, detention camps,
right?
Then that will inspire heroic martyrdom.
Yeah.
If you say there's a really exciting movie coming out, but it has really blasphemous and vulgar and promiscuous scenes or whatever else, and you can't watch it if you're going to be a faithful Christian. Well, now it's just like, oh, come on. I want to, everybody else is talking about this series or this movie or whatever.
I interview my parents, not like formally, but a lot about being dhimmi in Egypt. Like, did you really feel like you were second-class citizens? Did you like, without a doubt? Yes, definitely. Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. Yes.
But historically, I think usually dhimmi under Islam would have been Christian and Jews, correct?
That's right. Although it would be true of anyone who is not Muslim, but particularly Christians and Jews, because that's much more the world, especially as Islam moves west. That's the world in which they're kind of sweeping through.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an important question that we're engaging with now, especially in wake of the controversy or people getting upset about Pope Francis's remarks recently about all religions kind of worshiping the same God. What would be your take on that and your response for Catholics?
I think that the way he worded it was at the very least confusing and misleading. Mm-hmm. We want to say on the one hand that there can be elements of truth in any religion. And in fact, like there is what St. Thomas Aquinas describes as a natural virtue of religion.
Right.
Like if you tomorrow discover some undiscovered tribe living on a desert island somewhere, I can already tell you they have religion, and they probably have a fairly sophisticated religion, which points to the fact that man has a desire to be in relationship with God. There is this reaching out to God, and it's motivated by several things. One, this interior calling of conscience and this sense of right and wrong. Two, the external knowledge that we live in a created world and can know about the Creator. St. Paul talks about this in Romans 1. But in light of that, you're going to get some things right. Like in your desire to be in relationship with God, you'll come up with some way of trying to please God, and it may be pleasing to him or it may be displeasing to him. Mm-hmm. We can recognize the things that are actually pleasing. Like when St. Paul is in Athens and he goes to the Areopagus, Mars Hill, he talks about the Athenians who have a temple or an inscription to an unknown God. And so he recognizes this religious longing and searching, and he tells them that he's there to proclaim the God they've been looking for. So he recognizes among these apparent pagans that they already are in some real way in a sort of relationship with God.
Yeah.
He doesn't say, scrap everything you've got, we're going to build from zero. He recognizes God has already been at work in their life. And so any good apologist, any good evangelist, any good missionary has to say, where is God already active in this person or in this people? Mm-hmm. And kind of draw that out and affirm it without falling into the trap of saying, therefore, we're all good enough.
Right.
Because clearly when we're saying opposite things about God, that can't all be true just from a logical level. When we're making different moral claims, let's take not even the case of Islam, take a more extreme example, like human sacrifice kind of religion.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to say Aztecs, Christians, cool, do whatever you want. Like we don't eat meat on Fridays. You sacrifice people, everybody, potato. It's not like that at all. Like there are actual differences, both at the level of truth and goodness,
right,
that have to be adjudicated.
I think,
and the Christian distinctive is that this is not just one more example of the natural desire of religion. This is not just one more attempt at man reaching out to God, but that rather God has come into the world with his outstretched arms, reached out to man.
Yeah,
I think that's why evangelizing is such an art, because to take what the natural law in other, or the virtue of religion, in other faith traditions, if you want to call them that, to take that to build bridges and then also then to complete or correct, it takes first humility that God does reveal himself to those who sincerely seek him. Mm-hmm. And to use that to then not be afraid, then to then not fall into religious relativism or whatnot. I think that's where kind of the art of evangelizing comes in. And so often I think that we fall into like the, religious relativism within different or like false ecumenism, because we don't want to fall into that spirit of condemnation or correction, which is good, but then we don't actually embrace the tension of, teaching properly or just, educating properly.
I would even say that this is part of a universal problem, meaning some of us are too quick to want to correct others.
Yes.
And some of us are, hey, I don't know why you're saying yes so enthusiastically.
I'm thinking of myself.
Oh, okay. I'm not just teasing.
From like
you and I think, are the
same
on
long time
this.
ago. Yeah.
And so it can be really good to say like, okay, what is the other person getting right?
Right.
But you can't just stay there.
Yes.
You can't say, oh, he's cheating on his wife because he's lonely. Like, by all means, you can say, where's the thing? Where's the authentic need being expressed there? And we can try to work with that. And a spirit of condemnation doesn't get you there.
Right.
But there are times where you actually do have to condemn bad behavior. You actually do have to reject bad theology. You have to do like the actual conflict work. But then you also have to do the underlying work of saying, okay, but what is this getting right?
Right.
And if you go back to your analogy about being in the woods and you hear a sound of something approaching, it's not even just that like, oh, we can all have a sense of that and we all have this natural virtue to understand that. Depending on what it is, you have to have the proper response. So in the case of God, where it's like, yes, if there's something coming to the woods, if it's something dangerous, you have to prepare, you have to respond the right way. If it's Jesus Christ coming with outstretched arms, there's a certain response you have to have. So it's not just moral relativism when you say that, because yes, we all have that natural virtue, that natural response to, you hear the noise in the woods or whatever it might be, the calling of the conscience, every man's desire to know God.
Yeah.
The response is the important part, and that's the distinguishing part too. I think even among Christians, Muslims, Jews, and any other religion, it's that response to that noise in the wood.
Yeah, and hopefully, Muslims and Jews listening to this will recognize like, oh yeah, this is something we should be able to agree on. This is not just about who can be the most right.
Right.
We actually think it matters for your eternal beatitude and happiness, whether you respond in the appropriate way. Yeah. Now, we'll leave aside all the tricky, complicated ways of how does God judge what we knew and all of that. That's not our concern. Mm-hmm. But we do have the concern of saying we want to help people make the best possible response to the ways that we believe God is calling them. And part of that involves helping people to realize who God is and how he's calling them in the first place.
Amen. Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining us. It was a great episode. And yeah, we'll look forward to having you on again sometime soon.
Good. I'd look forward to that as well.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thanks, Joe. If this episode was helpful for you, please consider sharing it with a friend, leaving a rating and review to help us spread the word, and donating at philosproject.org/give with the comment Catholic to support this podcast. To learn more about becoming a Christian leader in the Near East, check out our Pathfinder free online courses, also on our website. Thanks for listening. See you next week.